Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising on June 13th, Friday the 13th, a very inauspicious day for our world and for the prospects of a prosperous future for the human family, given the events over the last 24 hours as Israel launched a preemptive unilateral attack on Iran at levels that are unprecedented in the history of the conflict between Israel and Iran and the United States, which is the full backer of Israel against Iran. And so today we want to begin our conversation with a narrative of what happened, and then I would like to broaden the context for understanding what's happening because I think it's only the understanding of the broader context that allows us to connect the dots in a meaningful way and not be swept away by the propaganda that's being now spewed out in the mainstream media in Europe and certainly in the United States. Because as they always do in times such as these, there is an orchestration of the narrative to influence the minds of the public to support activities that anyone of sane and sound mind would repudiate as criminal, unethical, and counterproductive to human well-being. So in the early hours of the 13th today in the Middle East, Israel attacked Iran and targeted three areas. First, the decapitation of the political and military leadership, various scientists working in the nuclear program for Iran. They killed the military chief of staff and the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, two scientists, as far as we know. They also targeted Iranian strategic defense infrastructure, the capacity of the Iranians to take out the incoming Israeli missiles. And then thirdly, they attacked the nuclear reprocessing facilities that Iran has been building in terms of developing nuclear power facilities in Iran. As we consider the implications of this, it's very important to understand a couple of things of an immediate nature. The purpose of this is regime change. The Israelis have made it clear, as has the United States, that this is not just a tit for tat like happened in 2024, where after the Israelis blew up the Iranian embassy in Damascus and then assassinated the political head of Hamas, who was attending the inaugural ceremonies of the new Iranian president in Tehran. And Iran, as you may recall, on two occasions after these Israeli attacks, notified people that it was going to attack back and did it in a very measured way, a very minimalist way to demonstrate that it had the capacity to strike into Israel Israel's response and then Iranians' response were limited, uh, calculated for non-escalatory responses. But what it did is it demonstrated that these two countries were now ready, willing, and able to attack directly into each other's territories, something that has not happened before in the entire 46-year history of the Ayatollah's regime in Iran. So that in and of itself was an escalation. And now we have a further escalation into a debilitating Pearl Harbor level attack on Iran with a specific intent to continue these attacks with a motivation for regime change. I'll be commenting more about this in a few moments. Now, but the second thing that I think is really important for us to bear in mind is that this was happening not simply on its own, but in parallel to negotiations that have been taking place between the United States and Iran under the aegis of Stephen Witkoff, the special envoy of President Trump, not only to Iran, but also to the situation with Hamas in Gaza and also the situation between the United States and Russia as it pertains to Ukraine. Stephen Witkoff is a close personal friend of Donald Trump's, and as presidents have done before, when they really want to ensure confidentiality and full awareness of a negotiating process, they will send a trusted personal friend, like Franklin Roosevelt in the Second World War sent his very close friend Harry Hopkins to negotiate with Churchill, to negotiate various aspects of the U.S. Relationship prior to and into the Second World War. Stephen Witkoff and the Iranian officials were negotiating and they were saying that everything was going well and they were about ready to have their sixth meeting and everything was optimistic. The United States kept shifting the goalposts, but there was an arrangement from the Iranian point of view and what was beginning to happen geostrategically. I've mentioned before that one of the aspects of the negotiations was the inclusion of Russia, as Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump were talking about how to deal with the Iranian situation. So the agreement that was emerging was that as Iran enriched uranium above a certain percentage, I think it's 3.8% enrichment, which means it could be weapons grade, that uranium would be sent to Russia under international uh, surveillance and observation. So the Americans were going to be getting what they needed, no nuclear weapons program. The Iranians were going to get what they needed. They wanted to continue enrichment for a nuclear power program. The Russians were working with the Americans to ensure that any uranium enriched above a certain percentage would be taken out of the hands of the Iranians and taken to Russia, which is already a nuclear country. And then the attack last night. And then this morning, President Trump uh, commented on Truth Social that I gave the Iranians 60 days. Yesterday or today was the 61st day, and they didn't do what I told them to do. And so we killed them. He also said that the attacks were going to continue, and this is the moment when Iran has to give up and get it together and agree to all of our demands. I want everybody to take in the cognitive dissonance of what I just said. On the one hand, you had what seemed to be good faith negotiations, but all the time, the Americans and the Israelis were planning a decapitation strike for regime change against Iran. As Jeffrey Sachs said this morning in his comments, we're witnessing diplomacy for the sake of war. If you don't agree with what we're saying, we're going to kill you. That's the U.S. Israeli method of diplomacy. What this signals about the integrity of U.S. foreign policy is extraordinary. As people all around the world, having been led into this false narrative that somehow Trump was trying to sort things out and he was doing his best to be a peacemaker, and all the while, the U.S. and the Israelis were preparing a decapitation strike, which they have said, both in terms of Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister in Israel, will continue. Until there's a satisfaction of their demands or regime change in Tehran. I want to comment on this by broadening our scope of history and understanding in the following way. What we're seeing on the part of the United States and Israel in the Middle East is an orchestrated strategic attempt to establish full spectrum dominance by the United States and Israel over the entire Middle East region by force of military power and supremacy of might over diplomacy. You've seen over the last almost year and a half as the Israelis have sought to exterminate the people in Gaza, obliterate Hamas, destroy Hezbollah in Lebanon, repeatedly attack Iran. The United States has been involved in every single aspect of that attempt. It's coming at the conclusion of a policy formation that was initiated and articulated by Benjamin Netanyahu back in 1996. And the policy was called Clean Break. Netanyahu called for the destruction of 7 countries in the Middle East to ensure Israeli supremacy: Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, and finally, Iran. This has been the strategic formation of the United States and Israel as official policy since that time. And if you look at what's happened over the last nearly 30 years, Iraq was destroyed, Afghanistan was destroyed, Lebanon was destroyed, Syria was destroyed, Somalia was destroyed, Sudan was destroyed, Libya was destroyed while they were at it. And now they're going after Iran to ensure that Israeli supremacy, as they commit genocide and exterminate the Palestinian people, is unchallenged, not only by the Arabs, but by the world itself. That's what's going on in the Middle East. The parallel that I would like to draw so that we understand the danger we're in is that what I just described from 1996 and this policy of clean break in the Middle East has been mirrored by what the United States has been articulating for itself. Beginning in March of 2001, in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of, 1991, with an immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, that defense guidance memorandum issued in March of 1992, within 90 days of the collapse of the Soviet Union, articulated the macro strategy of the United States to establish full spectrum dominance over the world. So what the Israelis and the Americans are doing in the Middle East is part of a larger doctrine of establishing U.S. supremacy over the planet. It's right there in black and white that the United States, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, would not tolerate the rise of any power anywhere in the world that would challenge U.S. military, economic, and political supremacy. On the basis of that, they moved NATO to the east, which culminated in the war in Ukraine, which is now being played out. And a few years later, Netanyahu, seeing what the Americans were doing in terms of U.S. full spectrum dominance, articulated the same for the Middle East. And the neocons in the United States that were architecting the dominance of the United States came together with the Zionists in the United States and the Israeli government to effectuate the same policy in the Middle East as the United States and Israel, like the United States and the NATO alliance, sought to control a specific region of the world. So just like the United States pushed NATO to the east to control all of Europe, and now all of Europe is a vassal to the United States, with an intent to break up Russia and then conquer China. And similarly, in the Middle East, They decided that they would start over time. They thought they were going to do it within 5 years. It's taken a little longer because history and human affairs never quite work out the way people plan. There are 90,000 U.S. troops in the Middle East as we convene this program today. Multiple countries in the Middle East have U.S. troops. Mossad, the Israeli intelligence, operates with almost impunity throughout the Middle East. And in fact, one of the aspects of the attack earlier today on Iran has been that Mossad secreted into Iran drones. And the drones that decapitated some of the leadership and blew up some of the buildings in Tehran and other cities around Iran in the last 24 hours were launched from inside Iran. Very similarly to what the Ukrainians mounted against Russia with the active support of MI6 and the CIA and Mossad against Russia several weeks ago, where they managed to camouflage and secret into Russia trucks capable of launching long-range drone missiles from inside Russia. And this leads me to 2 points that I want to make so that, again, we understand the gravity of the situation. I've mentioned before in my remarks here on Humanity Rising that in March of 2024, the head of Ukrainian intelligence, a gentleman by the name of Bogdanov, was in Washington, met with the military and the intelligence communities and the White House and in a series of meetings where he said, "We've lost the war. The Russian victory is inevitable. And what do we do?" So the understanding that the war was lost dates back at least more than a year ago. One would think that if you've lost the war, you would negotiate for peace, right? That's what losers do. They sue for peace. But no, the neocons said, let's start asymmetric warfare. If you're losing on the battlefield, we'll help you engage in other kinds of warfare so that we can really hit the Russians harder. And that's when they came up with this completely disastrous scheme of taking the elite troops of Ukraine and trying to invade into Russia and seize the nuclear power plant near Kursk in Russia, which is really close to the Iranian Ukrainian border. And remember all the news that the Ukrainians were launching this counterattack into Russia and seizing Russian territory. And there was this incredible triumphalism in the Western press against something that was an absurdity to begin with and ended in complete disaster for the Ukrainians and the deprivation of the Ukrainians of their elite forces. But we're not going to sue for peace. We're going to escalate. And then came the attack of missiles, where for the first time in history, between the United States and the Soviet Union and the nuclear age of mutual assured destruction, where the tacit agreement of every president and every Russian leader since 1945 is that whatever our conflict, we won't attack each other in our own territory. You can put kind of missiles in Cuba and you can, support the Vietnamese against the Viet Cong and so forth and so on. But the agreement between the superpowers was they would not arm any of their vassal states, any of their proxies, to launch a direct attack on the other superpower. But the Biden administration completely blew that off and launched long-range ATACMS missiles, operated and guided by U.S. personnel into Russia. And that's when the atomic clock of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists went to 90 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever come to midnight, even including the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. You have a momentum. Biden lost the presidency. Trump took over. And all the while, the neocons were preparing what happened a couple of weeks ago of helping the Ukrainians get these trucks into Russia. And then they escalated further because those missiles that they launched from inside Russia attacked the strategic triad, the nuclear strategic triad of Russia. Superpowers have three legs to their nuclear. They have it by air, by land, by sea. And the Ukrainians, meaning the Americans and the British and Mossad working with the Ukrainians, launched these missiles and they attacked the airplanes in Russia's Strategic Air Command, which were just sitting there on the runways by agreement of the treaties negotiated between the United States and the Soviet Union dating back to the 1970s, 1980s, whereby all the bombers in the United States and in Russia would be kept above ground, not hidden, so that they can be viewed by surveillance, a satellite surveillance of the other side, to make sure that nothing was destabilizing the balance of mutual assured destruction. So for the Ukrainians, working with the United States and British and Israeli intelligence to attack the Strategic Air Command of Russia is another escalation toward thermonuclear war. And for people to get a measure of what we're talking about here, just imagine if China or Russia teamed up with the North Koreans and went into Mexico and, with the complicity of the Mexican government, negotiated something with the drug cartels and secreted in trucks in the United States that blew up the Strategic Air Command outside of Denver in Colorado, destroyed our airplanes on the airstrip. Can you imagine the response of the United States? That's what we just did to Russia. poking them, trying to escalate, trying to exacerbate so that Vladimir Putin would make a false move, a reactive move, so then we could really clobber him without any regard to the fact that Russia is the largest and biggest and most sophisticated nuclear weapons power in the world, with weapons on hair trigger alert. That's what's happening in Ukraine as the Trump administration continues to send all of arms to the Ukrainians and engages with the Israelis on attacks on Iran to decapitate the Iranians, just like they've been trying to engage in regime change against Russia for the last 30 years. And in the middle of all this, a 22-year-old Swede, Greta Thunberg, gets on a flotilla, a little boat, unarmed, carrying food, humanitarian relief, and sails in all her innocence and all her vulnerability to Gaza. Can you imagine how Netanyahu and Trump and Mossad and the CIA looked at that? That's not even a flea on the buffalo's back. So you engage in another violation of international law. You go out and you seize everybody, you pick them up, seize the boat. Two of them are still in solitary confinement because they refuse to sign the letters or the statements that the Israelis are insisting that they sign. And they let Greta out because she's a celebrity. They wanted her out as quickly as possible. The point here is fundamental. That while the United States and Israel engage in a increasingly dangerous escalation of seeking full spectrum dominance over the world, over the Middle East, the result of the little Greta Thunbergs of the world is to continue to erode the narrative that the Israelis and the Americans use to justify the criminality in which they're engaging. And whether it's the encampments of the Palestinian students, the students supporting Free Palestine across the American universities and into Europe last year, which were brutally repressed, or Greta Thunberg and her colleagues going to Gaza. The power of social media is such that not only is the genocide on TV 24/7, but the narrative is continually eroded. So that even though Greta never got the goods to Gaza, she did succeed in eroding the narrative of the United States and Israel till now most people around the world, and I would say a majority of people, even in the United States and Europe, understand the reality for what it is. that the Ukrainian situation is futile, that the US-Israeli dominance of the Middle East is criminal. And so you have an inverse ratio going on. The more the ground disappears from under the feet of the neocons and more people understand the reality of what's going on, the more desperate they become. The more desperate they become. And that leads me to the following observations. The desperation of the Trump administration, and I would say the Zionists in the United States that control U.S. policy, just like the neocons have controlled U.S. domestic and foreign policy for the last 30 years, as they've been orchestrating this strategic formation with the CNNs and the MSNBCs and the Fox Newses and BBCs and Deutsche TV, et cetera, celebrating everything that's being done. As the public support has eroded, they have increasingly been eviscerating free speech. And this is particularly true in the United States. And I want to comment on this in the following way. You know, the U.S. Bill of Rights gives people, at least for the last 250 years, a constitutional protection of free speech. Americans can burn the flag. Americans can call for even armed insurrection. Nazis can go through Jewish neighborhoods. The Ku Klux Klan can burn crosses. That traditionally has been the rubric of free speech in America. You know, you think of the forget the name of the trial, but Skokie, Illinois, back in the 60s, where the Nazis marched through a Jewish section of Holocaust survivors in Skokie, Illinois. And they were challenged. The Jewish people said, you can't do that. That's a violation of any notion of free speech. And the Supreme Court said no. If free speech means anything, this is what it means. As Voltaire said at the beginning of the French Enlightenment, during the French Revolution, I disagree absolutely with what you're saying, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That's been the basis of free speech. All that is going away. Now they're saying, as they attack Harvard and attack Columbia and attack Yale and attack universities all around the United States, if the Jewish students don't like it, you can't do it. And we will attack you in every way we can, taking federal monies from research, taking away your nonprofit status, in every way undermining the integrity of the freedom of academia if you don't snuff out any criticism of Israel and the genocide that's going on in Gaza. That's the extent to which the neocon Zionist cabal is prepared to go to preserve the war machine that is seeking full spectrum dominance over the world, over the Middle East. And we need to understand that what is happening in the particulars of the news, whether it's attacking Harvard, shutting down the encampments, attacking Iran with the motivation of regime change, is all happening within the framework of a strategic formation that has been developing since the collapse of the Soviet Union to ensure the global supremacy of the United States of America and the country which represents this hegemonic motivation in the Middle East. And that leads me to what has been going on in Los Angeles and increasingly around the country, which I think is an aspect of this miasm. Because as I've said many times before, the consciousness that legitimates and supports genocide in Gaza is the same consciousness that supports the Israelis engaging in regime change efforts in Iran to destroy Russia in Europe and is attacking Harvard in the United States and now going after the foreigners who happen to be in the United States who are not white. It's all one consciousness. It's all one interrelated strategic formation. And it's very important for us to understand that it's not happening episodically or randomly. That's the seduction of Donald Trump. People think that he's kind of crazy and he's impulsive and he doesn't modulate what he says. And he does one thing on Tuesday and another thing on Thursday, and you can't even keep up with it. And then yesterday, they attack a standing U.S. senator in Los Angeles, Alex Padilla, U.S. senator from California. California is the fourth largest economy in the world. He's the senator. And he went into a press conference of uh, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the FBI and agents there roughed him up, threw him to the ground, and handcuffed him. A U.S. senator. And then before the day was out, we were hearing about an attack on Iran. You can't keep it up, and you can't keep it up by design. Because if you can't connect the dots, you can't take any kind of meaningful action, and that's happening by design. There's a method to Trump's madness. His madness serves the method. Everybody needs to understand that. There's a strategic formation behind Donald Trump that I've talked about before, and that's this impulse, an aspect of neocon mentality and strategy for what they've called since Dick Cheney and 2001 and 9/11, the unitary presidency. That if you're in a national security situation, like 9/11. You can't have the regular constitutional balances of power. You can't have democratic freedom. You can't have free speech because you're in a national security situation. If your house is on fire, you don't have time to vote. You let the strong man make the decisions. He's going to tell everybody what to do. So the unitary presidency, the theory of the unitary presidency, which is to collapse the constitutional checks and balances and allow authoritarianism, is the psychopolitical method of ensuring the cohesion of state power to effectuate full spectrum dominance, because it's not going to happen with everybody having a point of view. That's what you see in Israel, is the collapse of democracy. That's why Netanyahu, a year and a half ago, was trying to eviscerate the judiciary. Because if you're in perpetual war, if you're seeking to dominate militarily the world, democracy is an impediment. The global commons are a joke. That's Greta Thunberg. They're not even fleas on the buffalo's back. And that is what fascism is. And we need to understand, particularly here in the United States, we're in the midst of a fascist takeover. And this brings us to LA. And I want everybody to pay attention to what I'm saying. Because when you contemplate the thought that the United States of America, which articulated probably the most extraordinary constitutional and democratic method of governance, maybe in history, is now succumbing to fascism, it's very important that we understand what's going on. And I want to begin with referring to Hannah Arendt's masterwork on the origins of totalitarianism, which she wrote in the aftermath of the Second World War, having observed the rise of the Bolsheviks in Russia and the rise of the Nazis in Germany. She said that at the heart of fascism, totalitarianism, is what she called the exclusion of the juridical man, that you create categories of people that are understood categorically, legally, as outside the protections of any law. So you had the Jews in Germany, the gays, the mentally ill, the Slavs, which were judged by the regime to be extrajudicial. Laws pertained to the Germans, not to the Jews. Under Stalin, it was the kulaks, it was the bourgeoisie. And if you were designated a bourgeois business executive or whatever, you were outside the law. If that's the case, then you can take any extrajudicial means to deal with these extrajudicial people. It's an extraordinary insight of Hannah Arendt into the origins of totalitarianism, the notion of the judicial man, as she put it, the judicial person. That's LA. The Immunization and Customs Enforcement Agency is now authorized by Stephen Miller, Director, Chief of Staff of the President of the United States, who's ordered ICE to start arresting 3,000 people a day. And he said, go to Home Depot, go to Walmart, go to wherever these alien colored people congregate and just start arresting without charges, without due process. Just do it, he said. And then we deport them. Because these aliens, as they're referred to, not humans, but aliens, have no rights in this country. And so we've seen on TV, I'm sure you guys probably saw this, they've even gone to the courthouses where aliens have been going through the due process of seeking to become naturalized or whatever, or extend their work visas or whatever it is in a legal way, and seizing them. A woman who had 3 kids, all spiffed up, going into the courtroom to do it. They seized her and put the kids in handcuffs. One of them was 6 years old, carted them off. They did it yesterday to Senator Padilla of California. They didn't even know he was a senator. He was just some guy, Hispanic, that came in and looked like he was going to make trouble. Take him out. That's what's happening in the United States of America. It's a systemic, strategic deconstruction of the civil institutions that have undergirded the democracy that we here in the United States have lived and enjoyed for nearly 250 years. We'll be marking the 250th anniversary of this country next year. And we're going to celebrate it with a fascist state. That reality should shake the foundations of our minds. That the greatest democracy is now succumbing to fascism and totalitarianism, reinforced by the instrumentality of technology. You've all heard that the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, led by Elon Musk until very recently, was going throughout the federal government structure, gathering data on every person in the country. Social Security data, Medicaid data, IRS data, and putting it in a great big data bank. Do you know who controls the data bank? Palantir, founded by Peter Thiel, a South African Afrikaner, who, along with Elon Musk, founded PayPal, through which they became billionaires. Articulating technocratic authoritarianism, as they as they refer to it, because the unitary presidency requires technological support. So everything that we do is garnered. All the texts, all the phone calls, all the WhatsApp chats, Signal chats, Telegram, Instagram, Facebook, everything is gathered into this massive database. And guess which agency has access? ICE. So they have an extraordinary capacity to monitor now. And according to the information that I've been given, they're already beginning the construction of concentration camps in the United States. And I want to just bring in some history, just so we know what's in store. In the early 1930s, when the Nazis had consolidated power and developed this notion of the extrajudicial man, they built the first concentration camps. There was about 10 of them. And they housed about 10,000 people. By 1939, in the beginning of the Second World War, they had over 100 concentration camps, and over 1 million people were contained in these camps. The gypsies, the homosexuals, the Slavs, the Jews, the mentally infirm. And then after that, after the war started, beginning in 1942, 1943, then came the death camps. The death camps didn't just pop up. The death camps were a conclusion of a logic of the unitary state, the judicial man, and what do you do with these people who aren't even human? First you lock them up, and then you just kill them. That's what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. After 80 years of Zionist exclusion and displacement for people who have no rights. Do you know that in the West Bank today, there's over 900 Israeli checkpoints? They've carved up the entire West Bank so that the Palestinians can't even travel from one town to the next unless they go through a checkpoint. And last night, when the Israelis started the attack on Iran, they shut the West Bank down. Nobody can move. That is totalitarianism. That's fascism. And then the next step is extermination. That's what we're seeing in Gaza. That's what happened in Germany. And the United States now is succumbing to that logic as the Trump administration seeks to undermine the constitutional system, to build the unitary presidency and an authoritarian regime. And tomorrow, Trump's birthday, there's going to be a big military parade for the first time in the history of the United States. Up Pennsylvania Avenue, all these big tanks and planes and soldiers marching in formation, which is going to cost the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. And meanwhile, in LA, the Trump administration has also done something unprecedented by bringing in the U.S. Marines in violation of the Posse Comitatus Act of 1865 that specifically precludes the U.S. government using U.S. troops on American citizens. Trump's just blown through that one. Just blown through that one. So while Trump is in this kind of orgy of self-congratulation and doing what tyrants do throughout history, having a big military parade, a big spectacle, the fascists are always good at spectacles as a diversionary tactic to the public mind. All the new networks are going to carry this parade. Trump's going to be standing in. It's an obscenity. And it's going to be live on TV, just like the Nazi marches in the 1930s. And then extrajudicial people are being just deported. One of the camps they're setting up, as you all know, is in El Salvador, 70,000 inmates. And Kristi Noem, the same Secretary of Homeland Security that was in LA yesterday and had the senator roughed up, was down in El Salvador with these inmates, shaved heads, naked bodies, except for little shorts on, behind her, talking about how the U.S. government was going to be deporting thousands of people to these camps. There's another camp we've discovered that's in Somalia, in Africa. They're taking little Mexicans coming up over the border, desperate for work, and shipping them off to Africa, never to be seen again. So, I've been as explicit as I've been because we, particularly in the United States, need to understand the gravity of our situation. That Trump, like Benjamin Netanyahu, is not kidding. We're experiencing the overthrow of democracy in America. What we do about it is unclear. That we need to take a stand, as I've done today, is imperative. I urge everybody listening to this broadcast to go to a march tomorrow, June 14th. So while the President of the United States is celebrating the obscenity of a military parade up Pennsylvania Avenue, millions and millions of people will do what I intend to do, and I hope you intend to do: protest. Be willing to take a stand. They want you to be afraid. And in the face of the fear, we must have courage. If I was in Washington, I would be there on Pennsylvania Avenue making a stand. That's what we have to do. Because stronger than the president, stronger than the tanks, is the integrity of the citizen taking a stand for truth and justice. And if we can do it in sufficient numbers, we may be able to create a critical mass of resistance. But in order to do this, we need to be clear, as I have sought to be today, about what's really happening in our world and in the United States, as this mentality of the neocons and the Zionists around full spectrum military dominance of the world, using diplomacy purely as a subterfuge for military activities and building authoritarian power inside the boundaries of the United States, using the military against the people of the United States, must be taken absolutely seriously as the method behind Trump's madness. That's what's true, in my humble opinion, on Friday the 13th of June, 2025. So thank you, everyone, for joining us here on Humanity Rising. It's always a pleasure. I know that sometimes my words are sobering, but we're in a sober time, and we need to understand that. And I'll join the after chat for a little bit. You're all welcome. You'll see the link in the chat box that Stan has just put in. You also receive the link to the chat box in your Zoom reminder for today. And I'll see you next Friday for an ongoing reflection and commentary about the extraordinary issues and events that are unfolding all around us in this most potentiated moment in history. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.